The bride who killed the king and was left alive. She killed the king. Everyone saw it, the blood, the silence, the blade in her hand. But what no one speaks of is what happened next. She wasn't executed. She wasn't exiled. She wasn't even crowned. She was simply left alive. The great hall hadn't been touched since the murder. Not a single servant dared step inside, not even to clean the bloodstains that had dried into the marble like rust on bone. The velvet banners were still hanging, faded red, their ends torn as if they'd tried to flee. At the center stood the empty throne, still draped in the white shroud meant for a wedding, still soaked with the blood of King Otharion, the devourer of crowns, the man who ruled with terror and tried to marry his only daughter to preserve his cursed bloodline. Her name was Serelith, 17, silent, shamed, and yet, strangely, still breathing. She had slit her father's throat before the eyes of the court. A single slash from the ceremonial blade, meant to bind them in sacred union, had become a public execution. The priest had dropped his book. The guests had frozen. Her brothers, all 5 of them, stood motionless, like vultures unsure which carcass to descend upon. But no soldiers dragged her away. No judge summoned her. No executioner lit a pyre. Instead, the room emptied. Like everyone had agreed, silently, wordlessly, to let the shame settle like dust, as if punishing her would force them to speak aloud what had truly happened. She killed her own father. She was going to be his bride. We all knew, and we did nothing. Now, days later, Serelith still walked the palace halls, ghost-like, trailing silence behind her. Servants averted their eyes. Nobles crossed corridors. Even her brothers, grown men raised for war, refused to look her in the face. In the mirror of her mother's old chamber, now a storage room for forgotten portraits, she saw what remained of herself. Not a princess, not a queen, not a prisoner. Just a girl no one dared to punish because they were too afraid of what she represented. And every night, the same words echoed from behind the council doors. Why is she still alive? She has no claim. Let her rot. But Serelith wasn't rotting. Not yet. Not while the throne stood empty. Not while the ones who watched her kill her father still fought each other behind shut doors. If I couldn't rule after death, I would have made you my crown. Her father's final words, then I will be neither. She whispered back to the air, to the stone, to herself. She waited for judgment, for exile, for death, but none came. Only silence. And in that silence, Serelith began to understand the truth. No one would punish her because no one wanted to touch the guilt that bled with her. They would leave her alone. And in doing so, they would make their worst mistake. They didn't chain her, but they locked every door around her with words, glances, and fear. For 10 days, Serelith was left untouched, but never unobserved. Her chambers were moved to the north wing, far from the court, far from her father's crypt, far from any windows that overlooked the throne. They said it was for her safety, but no one had tried to kill her. Yet, "You are not a prisoner," said the eldest prince, Valen, voice smooth as oil on steel. "You are the daughter of the dead. That is all. We simply need time to grieve, to decide." She nodded, said nothing, but her fists curled beneath the table. Valen smiled like a man already crowned. In the halls, portraits of Otharion were covered with black cloth, but none were removed. His legacy lingered like mold, silent, foul, consuming everything from within. And the people, they didn't revolt. They didn't chant her name. They stayed home, whispered, waited. Serelith walked like a shadow now, wrapped in silence she hadn't chosen. Even her old handmaid, Betrayal, once her mother's most trusted aide, refused to speak of the murder. She only brushed her hair at night, tight, rough, like trying to pull the crime out strand by strand. "He was your father," Betrayal whispered one evening. "Even beasts bury their own blood." That night, Serelith didn't sleep. On the 13th day after the murder, the council summoned her, not to the throne room, to the old blood altar deep beneath the palace crypt, a place of ancient law, of punishment. She entered alone. The princes stood in a half circle. Cloaks of mourning, eyes like vipers, no guards, no crown, just judgment hidden behind civility. "We have chosen to spare you," Valen began, "but you must renounce any claim to the throne. You must vow silence. And you must never again speak of what he tried to do." Another brother, Prince Mairon, added with a smirk, "You'll be safe, of course, sheltered, provided for, a relic of the past like your mother's pearls. Just don't shine too brightly." She stared at the altar, still stained from old sacrifices. She didn't weep. She didn't scream. She bled, silently, from the palm of her hand as she cut her own skin open with the ceremonial blade, the same one used to kill her father. "I vow this, I will not forget, and neither will the stones of this hall. You may strip my name from your books, but not from your nightmares." She left the altar not as a queen, nor a prisoner, but as a silence too dangerous to kill. And in the corridors of power, her silence echoed louder than any cry for the crown. They didn't exile her to a tower. They exiled her from memory. 3 days after the vow of silence, her name disappeared from the book of succession. No announcement, no funeral of titles, just ink scraped off parchment. In her stead, a blank space, like a wound never stitched, left to fester. The court began to speak of the princess that was, as if she had died. Yet Serelith was still alive, her feet pacing a garden no longer hers, her eyes watching the doves she once fed now circling above her like vultures. That same morning, Prince Voran, the second-born, a blade without polish, always lurking behind Valen, declared himself protector of the throne. The third Prince, Caelric, challenged the title before sundown. The facade of unity crumbled, and Serelith, though stripped of voice and name, saw it all. At dusk, she was quietly escorted by 2 palace guards down a path that once led to the royal library, but now curved through old servants' quarters, out into the fog-covered hills. "It's just a temporary relocation," one guard muttered. "A retreat," said the other, "for your health." But there were no horses, no farewell, no family, just a sealed carriage and the cold slap of mountain wind as they passed through the north gate, the same gate once used to expel traitors. As the iron portcullis dropped behind her with a groan, she turned once. Not a soul watched, and that hurt more than any blade. She was sent to the monastery of the Pale Sisters, a forgotten stone keep carved into cliffside. No prayers, no voices, just the sound of wind biting stone and bells that rang without meaning. They said it was a place of reflection, but it was a grave, a living grave. I was no longer a princess, no longer a threat, no longer real. I was a secret sent to sleep. On her first night at the monastery, Serelith discovered a letter hidden beneath the stone bed, written in dried blood. The throne belongs to none of them. One is not even his son. They thought silence would kill her, but in that stillness, something else began to stir, not rage, not revenge, but memory. She was not imprisoned with bars, but with memory, and that she could never escape. At the monastery of the Pale Sisters, time ceased to move. There were no clocks, no calendars. Only the slow rot of candles and the endless tolling of the bell every third hour, whether night or day. Its tone was always the same, hollow, distant, like a throat crying from the bottom of a well. Serelith was given a single cell carved from ice-cold stone. No windows, only a slit in the wall that let the wind whisper in, sharp as razors. Her meals were silent trays. Her only mirror was a polished copper plate, blurred and rusted. She stared at it each day, watching her face fade, her cheeks hollow, her eyes dulling. "You were a crown," she whispered to herself once. "Now you are dust in a forgotten book." She was not alone, but not truly with anyone either. The Pale Sisters, veiled women in white robes, never spoke her name. They cleaned her bedding without speaking. They avoided eye contact. But every evening, one of them would slide a small piece of bread under her door with a carved rune. Tainted blood. She did not know whether it was a curse or a warning. Weeks passed, then months. No one came, no messages, no change. One morning, she awoke to find her family ring missing from her finger. In its place, a string of dead crow feathers had been tied around her wrist. Another day, she found the walls of her cell had been scratched, not by her. There, etched in crooked hands, "They killed your name, not your breath." He knew she wasn't his. That's why he chose the knife. "The bastard walks with your crown." That night, Serelith screamed for the first time. Not out of pain, but the horror of knowing they were still watching her. Someone in the monastery knew the truth. "They buried me alive, not to forget me, but to keep me from speaking." But what grows beneath stone always returns twisted and sharper. She did not write letters. She wrote memory into stone. And while the kingdom above bled itself dry, the forgotten daughter beneath it began to remember who she truly was. Some queens conquer with armies. She began with ink and pain. At first, it was just a name, carved softly into the underside of her bedpost with a sharpened bone. Caelric. Her brother, the fourth born, the clever one, the cruel one. The one their father never looked in the eye. He was never Otharian's blood, the voices had whispered through the cell walls. He was the son of a prisoner queen, switched in her sleep. Serelith didn't know if it was true. But in this place, truth was no longer something told, it was something dug up. In the dark hours of snow-drowned nights, she began to write, not with ink, with blood and crushed bone. Using the shards of old altar stones, she scraped symbols into the cracks of her wall, a diary no one could read unless they knew the code her mother once taught her. Each symbol recorded a memory, each line a betrayal, each curve a path towards something she didn't yet dare name, return. I remember the look in Otharian's eyes when he saw Caelric, like staring into a mask made by someone else. I remember the day the wet nurse vanished. I remember the silence. That's where they hide the crime. Then one night, during prayer hour, a folded scrap of cloth was slipped into her cell by a veiled nun. Inside, a lock of silver hair braided in the shape of a serpent devouring its own tail, the old sigil of her mother's exiled bloodline. And beneath it, a single word stitched in red: heirs lie, blood remembers. Serelith froze. For the first time in months, her fingers trembled not from cold, but from something else: fire. Driven by instinct, she dug beneath the floorstones with her bare hands. Her nails cracked. Her fingers bled. Hours passed. Then, her hand struck something. A rusted iron box, sealed with wax. Inside, a royal decree signed in Otharian's hand, then crossed out. A baby's birth certificate, with 2 names scratched and rewritten. A broken locket, containing a woman's portrait with Caelric's eyes. It was no longer rumor. Caelric was never Otharian's son. He had no claim, but he wore the crown now. They buried me alive with truth. Now I will bury them with it. Serelith didn't need a sword. She needed memory. Because kingdoms forget. But blood remembers every lie it was forced to carry. The dead girl came back, not to live again, but to remind the living what they buried. No one opened the gates for her. She walked through Ashgate, cloaked in black, face pale as moonstone. The guards did not recognize her, or pretended not to. It had been 2 years since the coronation of King Caelric. The city was no longer hers. Banners had changed, streets renamed, and yet the people whispered. She walks like thunder with no sound. If that's a ghost, why does she cast a shadow? 3 days later, a crowd gathered in the Hall of Crownstone. A rare public trial was summoned under the pretense of investigating false claims to blood. The accused, Serelith, the presiding, King Caelric, the silent judge in the back, the high priestess who once held Serelith's newborn form and whispered the first rites into her skin. Caelric smirked. I mourned you, once. Now you reek of the earth you chose to lie in. Serelith didn't blink. You mourn the throne you stole, not the sister you buried. She reached into her cloak and dropped the rusted iron box onto the tribunal table. Its contents spilled out like vomit from history. The royal decree, the erased birth names, the blood-sealed confession of the midwife, murdered days after Caelric's birth. The silence was sharp enough to bleed. Caelric laughed. You think scrolls matter? Thrones aren't written, they're taken. Serelith stepped forward, her voice cold and certain. Then take this truth. You are not Otharian's son. You are the bastard of a northern whore traded for peace and power. I am the last breath of his blood, and I remember everything. Gasps, someone fainted. The high priestess stood. I held her, I named her, I branded her blood. That boy, she turned to Caelric, was born under a different moon. The trial descended into chaos. As the High Council argued, Caelric drew his sword. If she lives, I fall, so she dies. He lunged, but a blade intercepted him. It was Commander Elvar, the last knight loyal to Otharian. You swore on a crown forged from lies. I swore on truth, and I've waited long enough. The throne behind them cracked, literally, under the pressure of the chaos. Serelith didn't run. She stepped over the fragments. He thought he wore a crown, but all I saw was rust sewn with gold. A lie cannot hold a kingdom, not forever. Truth did not restore her. It ruined him, and that was enough. But even as the court trembled and the throne cracked, Serelith knew. The kingdom had no queen, not yet. You can bury a daughter, but can you silence a queen? The day after the tribunal, King Ceolric's body hung above the palace gates, throat slashed by his own ceremonial dagger. No one claimed responsibility. Some say it was a guard. Some say it was Serelith. She never answered. The High Council convened under emergency order. The kingdom had no ruler, no heir, no peace. And standing before them scarred, dressed in funeral black, her hair cut blunt like a widow of war, was the last daughter of Otharion. She has no husband, no son, no army. She has evidence and the people's eyes. She brings ghosts, not laws. The hall murmured with fear, not of Serelith, but of what her presence revealed. A kingdom crowned on a lie. A decade erased. A daughter who survived what none of them could even face. One by one, nobles stood to vote, their hands stained in ink, guilt, and calculation. When the vote was sealed, the room held its breath. The throne is vacant no longer. On the steps of Crownstone, where Otharion once beat his sons for crying too loud, the nobles now knelt. Not because they loved her, not because they forgave, but because truth bends the knee history tried to straighten. Serelith stood silent, a black crown held in her hand. She did not wear it, not yet. A boy in the crowd shouted, "Long live the blood that remembers." Councillor Varen. The people love stories, but can they survive truths? Serelith, they survived Otharion. They'll survive me. I don't ask for their love, only their memory. High Priestess, what shall we call your reign? Serelith, after a pause. The last daughter and the first queen. And so the silence broke. But power bought in blood is never quiet for long. As the bells told her name, Serelith knew the real war had just begun. She didn't rebuild the kingdom. She buried a wound that never closed. 3 years later, the kingdom bore no trace of Otharion's bloodline. No portraits, no heirlooms, not even his name. The line of kings had ended. And in its place, a silence had settled, deep, deliberate, and long overdue. Serelith ruled, not like a monarch, but like a mourner. She never wore a crown, never married, never named a successor. Instead, she opened the Hall of Forgotten Names, a stone chamber where the condemned and erased were honored. Each wall held fragments, torn parchments, old medals, bones burned and cleaned. Every week she walked those halls barefoot, touching each name with ink-stained fingers, and she whispered, "If I am remembered, then so are you." One morning, Serelith vanished. No death, no procession, no decree. Some say she fled to the mountains. Some say she joined a monastery. Some say she simply stopped needing to exist. But months later, on the banks of the river Vila, where her father once hung rebels as warnings, a statue appeared. A woman without a crown, holding a bleeding book, standing on a broken sword. At its base, carved in deep iron letters, she let the truth bleed and never tried to stop it. Serelith did not save the kingdom. She simply made it remember. Her legacy was not power, not peace, but memory sharpened like a blade. In the end, it wasn't justice that crowned her. It was the silence that followed her name and refused to forget. And now I ask you, if your story was erased, would you bleed to write it back? Would you stay silent? Would you take the crown? Or would you vanish and let your scars do the speaking? If you were Serelith, after everything, would you keep the knife or walk away from it all? Drop your thoughts. Would you forgive? Or would you remind the world who you were, one scar at a time? If this story stayed with you, hit like, subscribe, and share the video. Because sometimes history isn't in the books. It's in the voices that refused to disappear.